Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
The American think tank Council on Foreign Relations has ranked the 10 best and worst decisions in U.S. foreign policy history. With the past as our guide, is Washington learning from history or repeating it? Welcome to World Today, the panel discussion with me, Anna, in Beijing. U.S. foreign policy has seen its share of controversy, from violent westward expansion and interwar isolationism to numerous military interventions abroad. The Council on Foreign Relations surveyed more than 350 members of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, asking them which decisions left the most enduring legacies, for better or for worse. The Marshall Plan and the creation of the United Nations topped the best list. The invasion of Iraq, the Vietnam War, and the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement ranked among the worst. Now, as Washington grows more skeptical of multilateralism, reassesses alliance more transactionally, and returns to tariffs and sanctions, history feels closer than ever. So what lessons and what warnings does American diplomatic past hold for today? To explore this and more, joining us on the line are Zoon Ahmed, Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Josef Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University, Kuangyu, researcher at Institute of Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, before we dive into the discussion, I think it's important to clarify something for our audience. As one of America's leading foreign policy think tanks, the Council on Foreign Relations inevitably reflects certain U.S.-centric perspectives. At the same time, its ranking also reviewed the internal tensions and contradictions within American diplomacy itself. So today, rather than simply accepting or rejecting this list, we just want to use this decisions it highlights, both praised and condemned, to better understand the underlying logic of U.S. foreign policy. So let me start here. How do you interpret the logic behind this ranking, and why release such a list at the beginning of 2026? Professor Mahoney.
Well, it's a good question. And, I was looking at the list and trying to puzzle through that. For example, why would we rank the tragedies committed against Iraq worse than those committed against Vietnam? And why is there certain type of selection? Why are some things noted and others aren't? Here, I think I'll draw sort of a strange analogy. There are a lot of discussions, for example, related to basketball. Who's the GOAT? Who's the greatest player of all time? LeBron James or Michael Jordan? It's really a generational question. So people who are younger, people who grew up watching LeBron James, they tend to think he's the greatest, whereas my generation tends to think it would be Michael Jordan. I think there's a little bit of this type of generational bias in some of the first two examples. If we had created this list 15 years ago, even maybe certainly 20 years ago, I think most people would have regarded the Vietnam experience to be a much more grotesque experience in human history. That said, clearly people who grew up through that forever war, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, would probably be more likely to privilege that. So I think there's a little bit of this sort of generational selection bias going on. At the same time, I think there's another criteria of selection bias, which is a lot of the cases that have been chosen seem to be oriented towards a critique of contemporary policies. So I think we can look at a lot of tragedies in the past, but which ones are most relevant to current challenges facing U.S. government leaders, and which mistakes are they most likely to repeat? So there's something about contemporary problems that's sort of privileging the selection of previous problems. I think finally, though, one of the things that's really sort of misleading about the list is, there is actually a consistent logic through all of these negative events, even the dark side of many of the positive events. One of the problems, I think, is that in a certain way of looking at history, if you're looking at history from the liberal perspective or is largely a dominant Western perspective, you tend to look at historical events as discrete phenomenon. If we look at it from more of a Chinese perspective or of a Marxist perspective, we would look at how all of these events belong to a similar logic, a similar imperial logic or a similar win-lose logic, this sort of thing. And so I think looking at it from that Marxist or Chinese perspective, it's sometimes difficult for us to discern what really is the fundamental difference between what the U.S. did in Vietnam versus what it did in Iraq. And how do we really distinguish those things when it was the same underlying imperial behaviors that guided both unilateral decisions?
I think that's a very profound point. Zoon, what's your take? How do you see the logic behind this ranking and why release a list like this at the very first 2 months of 2026?
I mean, first of all, one of the points I was thinking about the selection of the worst and the best 10 decisions seems to also depend on the current consciousness of the American society. I mean, one reason, for instance, to distinguish between Vietnam versus Iraq could also be that the suffering of the Vietnamese at that point, even though there was a lot of awareness, there was a lot of mobilization within American college campuses, but Iraq is more recent, but also you have so many more Iraqis in the American society and people from the Middle East within the American society who are also working in think tanks, who are working in media, who perhaps make that suffering more understandable, more relatable, more tangible for the imagination of the American masses, maybe to some extent. Secondly, I think the choice of the timing, I feel the second term of President Trump has, by all standards, the extent his administration could go to reduce America's connection with traditional allies, to disrespect international norms or the international legal order, as we say it. It's also, obviously an important year for the United States as a country. But I think there's a realization that more reflection is required today towards, what were the mistakes of the past. And I think the position that the United States finds itself in today, especially, of course, conflicts and issues in the Far East or the Middle East or Latin America or countries like Afghanistan, they have been occurring every now and then. This isn't new, but the current conflict with Europe, for example, over Greenland, this becomes more vivid. And with current escalation between Canada and the United States, with the visits of both, Starmer and Carney to Beijing, I think this is a moment for American scholars and policymakers to really wonder, what direction is America's legacy heading towards? How much further can the country become isolated from partners, from long-standing partners, whose the economic opportunities that came with, for example, the Marshall Plan, post-Marshall Plan, all of that resulted in what they think is America's rise as a global power. And today, those very relationships, that level of trust that had been achieved is being sabotaged proactively. But I also, agree that it is a very US-centric, a list that maybe if Chinese scholars made the list or if Middle Eastern scholars made a list, it would look very different. But I think to that extent, we can accept that they look at the world from a certain vantage point. And reflection, given where the US stands today, extremely isolated, and the one country that is breaking international law at a pace which is more vivid, which is unapologetic, is something that maybe a lot of people did not expect.
Indeed.
Can I add?
Yes, please.
One of the interesting things about the Council on Foreign Relations is that although it's technically bipartisan, we can see that a lot of the examples that have been listed are more directly connected to Republican Party excesses historically. It's interesting because the Trump administration does not like the CFR, and the CFR is widely perceived as being made up of sort of old school center-left and center-right scholars who have a lot more in common with each other than they do with the current Trump administration. So there is a little bit of an ideological component and ideological critique that's going on in some of the selection of these cases that are being directed specifically at the Trump administration.
Kuangyu, what's your take and how do you look at the timing of the release?
Yes, I agree with the professors before, like they talked about the recent effect and the institutional effect of the CFR. In my perspective, I think the ranking reflects a broad consensus among American foreign policy historians about what works and what fails in long-term statecraft. I see a very clear message that you're trying to send that U.S. foreign policy endures best when it builds collaborative institutions rather than imposing unilateral force. So releasing this survey in early 2026, I think it comes a time when the U.S. is reassessing its global role amid renewed great power competition, ongoing conflicts, as elections and strategic reviews shape the next phase of American foreign policy. I think this survey also highlights in the shift how the U.S. understands its own diplomacy legacy. They are increasingly judging foreign policy not only by military victories or immediate political wins, but also by lasting stability, moral standing, and ability to sustain global leadership. Also, like the CFR, we must be mindful of its own stance. We know that CFR is one of the most influential foreign policy think tanks. It's even regarded as a so-called shadowed State Department, but it was founded after the World War I to underscore the importance of U.S. engagement in the world. We read an article from Michael Froman, who is the chairman of the council. He described the current geopolitical landscape as the most complex moment in the past 80 years. So he believes that we are entering a period of redefinition. We see questions that had long been resolved about the future, about the nature and the role of the U.S., and now suddenly getting a new questions. So in this sense, I think this release of this survey stems from pretty deep concern over the complexity and uncertainty that Trump's new world order has brought both to the U.S. and to the world.
Mm-hmm. Then, before we dive into the reflections, let's focus on several landmark cases first. The list ranks the creation of United Nations at the second best decision, the Bretton Woods system 7th, NATO 6th, and the Marshall Plan the 1st. This represents the high point of American institutionalism, often described as laying the foundation for U.S. global influence after World War II. Kuangyu, where do you think their best qualities lie?
I think these initiatives stand out as America's best foreign policy decisions because they avoid reckless unilateral action and instead build a so-called or in quote multilateral rule-based international order that preserved peace and prosperity for generations. We see the Marshall Plan rebuild devastated Europe, stranded the Western democratic allies, and blocked the spread of communism. Actually, more than that, it didn't just rebuild Europe. It created a self-sustaining economic bloc that has absorbed the Soviet influence. So turning the former adversaries into U.S. allies through shared prosperity. And also similarly, we see the UN created a diplomatic platform to prevent a direct great power conflict. We see the Bretton Woods system establish stable global finance and trade through institutions like IMF and World Bank, and also NATO provide collective defense that stopped a major war in Europe. So combined, they ended the cycle of destructive great power wars, unlocked global economic growth, and set predictable norms of international behavior.
Mm-hmm. Professor Mahoney, do you share the same stance, and what a positive impact did they have on shaping the post-war international order, and what hidden risks did they embed?
Well, I agree with Kuangyu substantially, although I would question the overall value of NATO, particularly in terms of what he said, in terms of it stopping the spread of communism, which I'm not entirely sure was a good thing, given my own political inclinations. But
yes, that's a West-centric idea.
Yeah. And certainly as we look at the continuing legacy of NATO and the way it's been operationalized to provoke new conflicts with Russia, but also the way that President Biden tried to pivot NATO against China. So, these are part of historical legacies. But I agree with Kuangyu's assessment that, institutional building was something that's very important. I would also raise some serious questions about Bretton Woods, dollar dominance, and the extent to which this, certainly brought some stability to the global financial system, but was also provided a foundation for the United States to impose economic hegemony on the global South. Of course, we're still struggling with this today as the world moves towards de-dollarization and the risks that continues to carry. However, again, to go back to sort of the historical context, clearly, what this list is trying to signal is a criticism of the Trump administration. So the extent to which we've seen the Trump administration pulling out of international organizations, abandoning the Paris Agreement, quitting more than 66 international organizations, including a large number associated with the United Nations, abandoning the World Health Organization. All of these things speak to a decline in multilateralism in tandem with Trump's declaration that he's essentially above international law. And I would say, although it's not clear that it's anything significant yet, but the mechanism that he tried to create with the Board of Peace, which was authorized initially by the United Nations Security Council, but appears to be a means for building an alternative to the UN Security Council, where he alone would call all the shots. It speaks to a very willful destruction of international institutions in ways that run very contrary to a multipolar world or this sort of multilateralism or multilateral approach to sort of international democracy that I think most countries are seeking. Finally, it's interesting with the Marshall Plan because today we look at not only the Marshall Plan and the tremendous role it played in helping to rebuild Europe, which ultimately served the strategic interest of the United States and Europe. But the immediate contrast is what we're seeing with China's Belt and Road Initiative and the extent to which we see the West, above all the United States, essentially abandoning the developing world. But at the same time, we see the U.S. trying to force countries to break their BRI partnerships with China, but not providing any sort of alternative development assistance. This is, I think, part of the context, in so much as we've seen a number of CFR and other American scholars saying, look, you're not really competing well with Chinese development schemes, and as a result, you're losing position globally. Now, whether or not that's a fair assessment, that's, I think, part of what the direct reference to the Marshall in terms of its contemporary context.
Zoon, just a moment about the comparison of the Marshall Plan and the Belt and Road Initiative, a quite topic we are frankly tired of arguing about today. But as an expert on BRI, do you see any similarity? And about the list, we were just chatting in the office. Some say this best legacies already contain the institutional DNA of American First from the very beginning. What's your take?
I'll go to the list and then come back to this comparison.
Yes, please.
Because alongside NATO, the United States also initiated CETO and CENTO, which were supposed to be the NATO versions of, Central and Southeast Asia, right? But those didn't work. NATO did. And yes, I also I have to agree with Professor Mahoney. I mean, that's the way NATO has been weaponized and the way it has worked and played out. There are many issues with that. So we definitely see that the CFR scholars, I mean, they do have that perspective of what has strengthened versus what has weakened American hegemony or reputation as a global hegemon. I mean, I think to some extent that is a perspective that many in other parts of the world will disagree with. That said, I mean, I think the United States through the 1950s, 60s, even to some extent 70s, they were proactively helping or working with these newly, independent nation states, including my own, to modernize their infrastructure. Pakistan, for example, had two of the world's largest dams, Tarbela and Mangla Dam, which were built by the Americans. They helped us modernize our agriculture. They helped us improve the yields as an agricultural country. That was important. So that interest that the United States had taken in the development of countries was there, even though it may have been problematic in some ways. And of course, it was part of this whole effort to deter the influence or further expansion of the Soviet Union in those countries, right? But that interest was there, and it was important when it came to the practical benefits or the practical utility of stronger partnerships with the United States. And even today, I mean, if we see that Professor Mahoney talked about, it's true. There is no alternative that Washington, or to a great extent, even for some time, the EU, They also criticized the engagement of developing countries, the global south, with China under the BRI. We have so many new theories coming out every now and then. They have to be so creative to think of why countries should reject this very obviously very practical and much needed cooperation with China. But they do not have any alternatives today. But in the past, they actually did. So I think that comparison is valid. And I think it is just the lack of capacity of the United States today, or even the EU today, to really provide tangible goods to the world at large, because either the administrations keep changing their posture, they also don't have expertise anymore the way China does. And I think when they talk about the Marshall Plan, maybe on some level, there is a realization that unless they are able to provide something practical, something useful to the world, their relevance, their importance will, deteriorate with time. Overall, if, let's say, the United States did come up with a plan for developing infrastructure in other countries and they're able to execute it, I also don't think that China would have an issue with that. I mean, if really the global powers came together to help build the world so that we can all, benefit economically, like clearly even in the list I mentioned, the Marshall Plan became a source for the United States to, even be able to build itself as an economic power. And that same logic can extend globally today, right? Mm-hmm. There shouldn't be any problem with that. But because they lack the capacity, they lack the expertise, they lack the political will, the ability to execute that, I think they just, the easiest way is to just, criticize what China is doing in the BRI. And I think obviously they see what China is doing is something that had worked for the United States in the past. And they see their own position weakening and China's, further increasing, using the same logic of, what had worked for them as a global power, especially when it came to more practical. And people forget that in the 50s and 60s, the United States was actively involved in helping countries improve their infrastructure.
Well, Zoon,
yes,
there are two issues there to illustrate your point. The first is you look at the tremendous waste and failure of the United States in Afghanistan, where the trillions of dollars spent and nothing to show for it. So, if you wanted to hold up sort of an example, but even worse than that, you look at the failure of the United States to even take care of and redevelop its own infrastructure. So you're absolutely right to say that the U.S. has lost this capacity for whatever reason, due to corruption or a lack of political will, or simply a loss of capacity, say comparable to what we can see with some of China's major state-owned enterprises. But nevertheless, I think that these are prime examples of why the world can't depend on the U.S. Because even when we've seen them trying to act on their own behalf or concentrating efforts in other countries, it's been an absolute failure.
Can I add a very quick point?
Yes,
I completely agree with that. They have in one of the worst decisions the coup against the Mossadegh government. And even within that, they state one of the reasons is that normalized this kind of interventionism and adventurism for the United States. And from then on, the list is endless. So I think that these things are also connected from emerging as a power that recognized the value of providing practical benefits and goods and having an economic tilt. They shifted towards being a power that thought, okay, the easier way is just to orchestrate a coup or just to, fuel instability in a country. And that's an easier way to recruit allies or partners or to reduce the possibility of less friendly states from operating within their own environment. So I think that being in the list is maybe, I'm not sure if the other panelists agree or if you yourself agree, but I think the logic of that it normalized this kind of adventurism is also something worth noting. It was a departure from a more pragmatic way to conduct themselves towards a more coercive.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for your in-depth perspectives. Let's have a short break. Coming back, we'll continue our discussion on the most consequential moments in U.S. foreign policy. This is Real Today. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're listening to Road Today, the panel discussion with me, Anna, in Beijing. We've been talking about some of the most consequential moments in U.S. foreign policy. Let's continue our discussion. Since we've already brought up the Middle East, let's take a look at what's actually on the table when it comes to U.S. Middle East policy. The 1953 coup against Iran's Mossadegh is listed among the worst decisions, though at the time it was framed as defending the free world. In today's U.S.-Iran tensions, Kuangyu, what lessons does history offer? Has U.S. policy toward Iran fundamentally changed?
I think not. We see the 1953 coup in Iran shows a persistent pattern of U.S. policy towards the Middle East. For the past century, American intervention has often operated under a so-called dual narrative. They speak publicly about supporting democracy and defending freedom. They act privately to secure access to energy resources, maintain especially key regional alliances on the continent, and limited unwanted influence from other powers. This combination of idealistic language and strategic self-interest has remained consistent, and democratic goals has always been the top priority when they conflict with the core geopolitical and economic concerns. But the main historical lesson for today, U.S.-Iran tensions, is that outside interference creates long-lasting distrust. We see that coup undermined Iran's political development and left a legacy of suspicion that still shapes bilateral relations. Interventions that ignore a country's sovereignty and public and realistic conditions will not produce stable outcomes. They often lead to greater instability and hostility over time. And U.S. policy towards Iran, I think, now is maybe changing in tactics, but not in fundamental goals. Today, the U.S. still relies more on sanctions, deterrence, diplomatic pressure, rather than direct regime change operations in Iran. But it still seeks to limit Iran's regional influence, protect its allies, and preserve the U.S. strategic position in the Middle East. And these core objectives have remained largely unchanged, which is why I think the relationship would continue to face deep and unresolved tensions. And also now here is a new power that the U.S. needs to think about is China. They are trying to push China out of this era.
Mm-hmm. Professor Mahoney, what's your take? Over the years, has U.S. intervention in the Middle East ever escaped the binary of democracy promotion versus resources control?
Well, I agree with virtually everything that Kuangyu said. I would just add a few other little details, which, in fact, we could go back to the Safavid dynasty of 1501 and the establishment of Shia religion as a way to distinguish Persian culture from Arab culture that had conquered and spread Islam across Persia, and a desire to achieve sort of or reestablish, the cultural privileges associated with one of the ancient cultures of the world. To some extent, that legacy continues to this day and certainly informs some of the broader context of conflict between the Shia and Sunni-led or influenced countries. I think one of the interesting things, if you go back to the previous government of Iran, which was close to the United States, it was also close to Israel. And this was in large measure because this was in contrast with the Arab countries that tended to lean to some extent towards the Soviet Union, although, of course, Saudi Arabia and a few others had close oil relationships with the United States. At the same time, though, we have to recall that at that time, the U.S. was supporting a king in Iran. It wasn't about democracy. And in the last couple of months, we've also seen the United States supporting a king as an alternative to the current Islamic Republic. So it's not really about democracy. It's about having someone in power who is going to provide some sort of benefits to the United States. And Kuangyu's absolutely correct that although the U.S. Strategic interest in the Middle East have shifted through time and the tactics have remained largely the same, the key emphasis today seems to be not simply responding to this longstanding claim that Iran poses an existential threat to Israel and the close ideological and cultural link between Israel and the United States, which remains sacrosanct, but all the more so because we do have a fundamental shift in geopolitics. We do have China having risen as a major power, we do have China playing an instrumental role in reshaping geopolitics, above all across Asia. We see China playing a powerful role through organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, among others, to bring peace and stability and development security to Central Asia. We understand that Iran plays an integral role in these efforts. We also understand that for a long time, there's been a paradigm in geostrategic thinking that holds that whoever can control Afghanistan can control Asia, including China. So this is, part of the reason why we saw the U.S. intervening in Afghanistan in the late 1970s, building the Talib, which went on to become the Taliban, to resist the Soviet support for the socialist government in Afghanistan. Certainly, as the British had long ago figured out, the tremendous strategic mineral wealth in Afghanistan that should make Afghanistan one of the most wealthy countries in the world, but also means it's a risk for whoever has access and or control over those resources. So there are all these sort of things swirling together, but the key right now with Iran is the extent to which Iran is in a strategic partnership with China and part of this strategic vision of greater security and development in Asia, which runs fundamentally contrary to the legacy of U.S. imperialism.
Mm-hmm. Zoon, are we seeing a change in how the U.S. deals with Iran, or just a rebranding of older strategies? And one thing to reflect on here is that why has U.S. so-called exporting democracy so often resulted in further, conflict, refugee crisis, and anti-American sentiment?
Wow, both professors have given such detailed, analysis of why we see the existing manifestation of US's, posture towards Iran. I think to answer your first question, I completely agree with a lot of the points that have been mentioned. The overall global picture has just become so complex. With China's rise, I agree, like with the SCO, China's rise, BRICS, the global south becoming less of a silent majority, I think there is an acute realization that the old tactics, those might have more lasting consequences. Within the Middle East, the United States is also trying to manage its relationship and to maintain its relevance with many other key players, the Arab countries. I think it's also a question of, we saw back in, I'm not sure if Professor Mahoney or the other panelists, they'll agree with me, but I think this refusal to directly get involved in intervention, might have to do with how complex Israel's own image has become globally. But it also reminds me of back in 2012, when at that time the Netanyahu government was supporting Mitt Romney against President Obama, and then Obama won the election. That's when the Iran nuclear deal did happen. And I think a lot of people who read into that was also the US also wants to maintain a balance and not have one country, even if it's such a close ally, have this kind of power over the United States to be able to, to a greater extent or entirely to determine how they deal with the region at large. So I think that same realization, Israel has become a complex country. The popularity of the country is obviously, very questionable at this point, more than ever in recent history. And then you have the Arab countries who can be partners. So in that situation, if the United States if the Trump administration still went ahead with supporting a coup or in a more obvious way, supporting regime change, I think that would also reduce their ability to work with those other allies, the Middle Eastern, the Arab countries, who are also now seeking deeper partnerships with China, and very actively so. So it's a very complex reality that the United States does confront. I'm not sure. Obviously, resources are the end goal. Democracy, wars in the name of democracy have always, historically, you look at any example, it's always been about resources. It's always been about reducing the ability of governments that might be unfriendly from the United States on vantage point to come into power. Look at what's happened in Syria. Look at what's happened in Libya. There is an idea that Gaddafi's biggest crime was that he was somehow gathering the African countries together to form a very powerful bloc that could again reduce the American hegemony's ability to have access, more unquestionable access to resources in that continent, and so on and so forth. So we have, democracy being a reason. I think that's been questioned very in every case that you see. That's clearly not the case. And like Professor Mahoney mentioned, Afghanistan, the creation of the Talib, it was obviously a joint effort, which included many countries. It had very severe ramifications for the entire region that we continue to face even today. And the same is in the Middle East. No country has been seen to be more stable. Libya was one of the strongest economies of the African continent, and look at where the country stands today. Look at Syria. And actually what's fascinating, I think I might go on a bit of a detour here, but before Trump's first election, he said that if American leaders just went to the beach and got a tan, instead of interfering in the conflicts in the Middle East, the world would have been a better place. And I think a lot of people resonated with that. If they did nothing, they did not sell weapons to so-called allies, they did not interfere in different conflicts, they did not side with different parties or different, resistance movements within the region, the whole region would have maybe found a better equilibrium. But what about the resources that come from the region? What about China's attractiveness to those countries? And that's when, I think even Trump, despite being less of a multilateral, or having less of a, this is also my view, that I think he's less hegemonic, so to speak, in his perspective than the Biden administration was. He is willing to complicate relations with the EU, with Canada, etc. He's more unilateral in his posture, but still he is also faced with complex realities and wants to, from his perspective, maintain the US's strength and control over certain regions. It's a more complex world. And I think the result is that we see decisions that are quite, more unilateral. The US cannot, at this point, withdraw from the world at all because there is just so much competition. There's China, there are other multilateral initiatives emerging from other centers of the world that might reduce their own access to resources and partners. Yeah, it's a very complex reality, but I think overall, we see a world that is much more critical and aware of the reality of American interventionism than ever before.
Mm-hmm. Then, if we look at the list, the invasion of Iraq ranks as the single worst decision, with the Vietnam War second. They're separated by nearly 40 years, but both were considered driven by manipulated intelligence and overly broad congressional authorizations. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the Iraq War resolution almost feel like the same script replayed. Kuangyu, how do you explain this historical repetition?
Yes, you remind me of what Hegel said. The only thing we learn from history, that we learn nothing from history. The pattern you mentioned, the pattern of repetition, reveals a lasting flaw how the U.S. makes major war decisions. The two episodes share a fatal disconnect between the U.S. ambitions and the local realities. And we see it in these institutional and political lessons do not automatically fix the U.S. behavior. Without stronger oversight, without honest intelligence assessments, and a deeper humility about the limits of the U.S. military power, I think the U.S. will remain vulnerable to repeat this pattern. And one more thing is that the fundamental issue, I think, is both wars constitute unprovoked invasions by a hegemonic power against sovereign nations. Under international law, in my opinion, the U.S. should have been held accountable for its war crimes, yet its leaders were not. They ran free. Nevertheless, America continues to routinely accuse other nations of crimes against such like humanity and war crimes and so on. So this is profoundly ironic and unjust. And following these recent events in Venezuela, we seem increasingly accustomed to the notion that Trump's War Department possesses an inherent right to wage war. Yesterday it was Iraq. Today it was Venezuela. But tomorrow it could be any other nation. And a greater irony is that America's targets have never been major powers on its equal footing. It attacked Vietnam and Iraq because the strong is bullying the weak, because the U.S. is confident of victory. Yet the outcomes were disastrous. Falling into traps of the U.S. own making, and even sometimes triggering domestic crisis and government change. So history, I think, will repeat itself, proving that unjust wars will only bring disasters upon themselves. And simultaneously, whether the U.S. seeks to return to Asia or pursue its so-called Indo-Pacific strategy, I think the U.S. should heed lessons from history. Let us not forget the Korean War as well. Should America, I think, if they want to engage a war or proxy war in Asia, I think negative outcomes are highly probable, perhaps even may lead to the collapse of U.S. hegemony.
Very insightful analysis. Professor Mahoney, why does this crisis to deception to war cycle in U.S. foreign policy seem so hard to stop? Is it institutional problem, or does hegemony itself require a permanent enemy?
Well, I think if you look at just to go all the way back in time to the beginning of the United States, the United States itself was initially an expression of British colonialism and the dispossession of land and resources from the indigenous people of the Americas. And this was repeated throughout the Western Hemisphere, from the most northern parts of Canada all the way down to Patagonia. We can see this tragic history. You then look when the United States begins to advance this paradigm, not simply by taking land from the indigenous, but committing various forms of ethnic cleansing and genocide against them in order to build up the country that it became. And then the next step of that is to start aggressing against nearby countries, Mexico, for example, to take most of the best land from Mexico, Texas, Southern California, parts of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. All of these were seized essentially at gunpoint from Mexico. And this is in the midst of doctrines like the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States says it has essentially a hegemonic privilege in the Western Hemisphere. You can then take that to the next step, which is looking at the Spanish-American War, which was fostered through duplicity and a false flag operation, which then leads to the Philippine-American War, where the United States goes in under this idea of the benign benevolence, but is actually suppressing indigenous efforts for independence, and brutally so. And just to remember, one of the things that really accelerated Japanese concerns to build an empire that could compete with the West was not only the entry of the European powers into China, not only the Germans building the first foreign naval base in Asia in Shandong, but also the establishment of the United States, the second foreign naval base in Asia by the United States in the Philippines. So it has, this ripple effect that goes on to play out in much bigger tragedies. There was always this deception. There was always this idea that the United States would enter the sovereign territory of others, and then when people tried to defend themselves, the U.S. would use this as a pretext for war. And even if that didn't work, they would simply lie. The Gulf of Tonkin, or what we saw in Iraq, these were nothing new. And by the way, we saw the same thing in Dominican Republic in 1965, the same thing in Grenada in 1983, the same thing in Panama in 1989, the same thing, a little bit different, but there was sort of a shifting, evolving narrative and justification for the war in Afghanistan. All of these things are not simply failing to learn from history. It's quite the opposite. They learned from history. They are deliberately repeating these patterns because that's what they were able to use in order to not only build their nation, but to extend their global imperial reach.
Appreciate that thorough explanation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's set aside the list for a moment. It's only the second week of February, but we've already seen dramatic shifts in Americans' relations with the world. So, Zoon, in your view, what has the U.S. done best in foreign policy so far this year, and what has it done worst?
I think somehow the best and the worst is the same. And I think one of the worst is also what they're doing with Greenland and Canada. I think that is the worst in terms of losing their own partners to a great extent. The trust that obviously Trump 1.0 was also very detrimental to the trust between their United States and Europe in general. But now I think Greenland has led to a situation where they think, okay, we can also be like other countries in the Middle East. And I think that's also the best because it's making other parts of the world realize that they need to be more pragmatic. So I think the overall effect is that the capacity of US imperialism to target, even their closest allies is maybe pushing those allies to look at other alternatives and to understand that it's important for them to connect with the world at large. So I think that for me, that action can have longer implications in terms of what it means for American imperialism.
Kuangyu, what's your take? How would you say America's biggest success and its biggest failure in its foreign policy this year?
It's a little bit harder because I don't know who I should speak for Americans, for Trump, or for the world as a general. But let me name one. Overall, I believe the wisest move by Trump administration has been maintaining a degree of rational and practical in its approach towards China. I think that's my point, especially among the series of aggressive, even reckless or irrational diplomatic maneuvers like Zoon has just mentioned. We see the leaders, China and U.S., have held another phone call recently, and positive elements persist within the broader strategic competition between the two nations. While we see there are numerous issues require careful management, but at least both sides still share a fundamental consensus of risk managing. So the new normal in U.S.-China relations might be managing competition and avoiding miscalculations, but let's go and see. And the worst part, I think, maybe Venezuela, the reason we all know why. And another I might mention is that Trump's support for Sanai Takaichi. Of course, if you stand for the U.S.-Japan coalition, it's right. But if you look at the world peace, I think it's very negative.
That's a great point. I'm curious to hear, Professor Mahoney, your take on this. So far in 2026, how would you evaluate the U.S. foreign policy? What's worked well and what's gone wrong?
Well, I think we can take sort of a broader view in terms of the negatives and say the way in which Trump has waged aggression. Now, we can speak of specific cases, Venezuela threatening the sovereignty of Denmark and Canada and many others. These are certainly key cases. But, what we have seen is a global trade war, which has basically tried to employ rent-seeking and mercantilist policies that are trying to basically dispossess other countries and to transfer vast sums of wealth to the United States. This is criminal, and it's also failing to actually improve the economic well-being of the Americans. So it's sort of doubly terrible. It's not only bad for the world, it's also bad for the Americans. So it's a catastrophic failure. At the same time, I think we have to point very directly to the Trump administration's what I would characterize as the weaponization of climate change, which again has global implications, which while the cost for the United States would also be high, the extent to which the U.S. depends on fossil fuels and a close relationship between fossil fuels and the dollar, and the extent to which the U.S. economy continues to depend on the hegemony of the U.S. dollar. The U.S. position as a global north country means that its price or the cost associated with climate change relative to countries in the global south, most notably China, Brazil, India, others. These rising countries, these emerging markets that are directly pushing back against U.S. hegemony, these are the countries most at risk due to climate change. And so I'm very concerned that quitting the Paris Agreement, denying that climate change is a problem, instead saying it's a communist plot that comes from China that's trying to knock the United States down. I think these are things that threaten the lives and well-being of everyone on the planet, and what would be remembered, I think, as one of the grosser crimes associated with this administration. Finally, we can look at the policies towards migrants and immigrants. One of the things that we see on the list is the way in which the U.S. treated the indigenous populations in the United States historically, and that's understood as a foreign policy issue, and rightfully so. But of course, the same is true for the migrants in the U.S. and the extent to which we see the U.S. or the Trump administration specifically targeting people of color, specifically targeting for example, Somali Muslims in the Minneapolis area, people from Central and Latin America, among other places in the world, and the way in which this is going back to sort of the white republic values of Jefferson, but also Trump's hero, Andrew Jackson, who worked very hard to try to create a society where white men would continue to dominate, not only domestically, but perhaps overseas as well. Now, in terms of the positive, I don't think we can point to anything really positive at this time. I think that there is some speculation that Trump might have superficially attacked Iran and when the last bombing took place in order to diffuse that pressure. I'm not sure that we can really make that assessment at this point. We can question whether or not his efforts to create peace and resolve the conflict in Ukraine are measures in good faith, or whether they're part of a broader strategic plan that has other negative ulterior motives. But thinking about it a little more abstractly, I think when we read documents now, like the new national security strategy, what we see is just a complete transparency. We just see the true face of American unilateralism, the American determination to abandon as much as it can international organizations, and the extent to which the Trump administration believes itself to be above international law. And I think while all of those things are negative, that transparency is something that is good for the rest of the world to see.
Yeah. We could talk about this topic for hours, but unfortunately we ran out of time for this edition of World Today, and really appreciate all of your perspectives. Zoon Ahmed, Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Josef Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. Kuangyu, researcher at Institute of Taiwan Studies at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Anna. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.